Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling a topic many of you are keen to understand, the science-backed methods for fat loss.
Mhm.
You shared a fantastic resource with us, a detailed exploration from Andrew Huberman's Huberman Lab Podcast, and our goal is to really extract the most powerful and immediately useful information for you.
Right.
Forget all the confusion of online noise. We're focusing squarely on what the scientific evidence actually tells us.
Exactly. And the foundation of this deep dive is a pretty comprehensive discussion by a professor at Stanford School of Medicine specializing in neurobiology and ophthalmology.
Okay.
His work emphasizes practical, science-based tools for everyday life with a significant focus on fat loss. And this approach is, well, perfectly aligned with your desire for knowledge that's both efficient to acquire and deeply rooted in evidence.
And what really grabbed our attention is the often underappreciated role of your nervous system in the entire process of fat loss. While diet and exercise are obviously important, the nervous system acts as this crucial orchestrator in how we mobilize and then utilize fat for energy. Get ready for some genuine aha moments as we unpack this connection.
And for you, our listener, we know you value clarity and a structured approach that, respects your time while still providing meaningful depth. We're committed to breaking down potentially intricate concepts into digestible steps, highlighting the key insights so you can immediately grasp their relevance to your own journey.
Okay, let's lay the groundwork by discussing a fundamental principle. We all understand the basic equation, calories in versus calories out. However, what's truly fascinating is realizing that the calories out part isn't some fixed number. It's significantly influenced by factors that you can actively manage.
That's right. While a calorie is indeed a unit of energy, the simple idea of a calorie is a calorie in terms of its metabolic impact is, well, it's an oversimplification, especially when we consider how highly processed foods affect our body's energy processing.
Yeah, that's a good point. And here's where it gets really interesting. Our fat cells aren't just these passive storage containers.
No, not at all.
They're actually innervated by neurons. Think of it like having wires connected directly to your nervous system.
Which is fascinating, right? This neural connection positions the nervous system as a central command center for fat burning. It's not solely about circulating hormones. There's a direct line of communication between your brain and your fat tissue.
So the aim of this deep dive isn't just about creating a calorie deficit, though that's part of it. We're going to explore the science-backed methods through which you can actively engage your nervous system to encourage and maybe even accelerate the process of fat loss.
But before we delve into the specific tools, it's important to briefly touch upon some foundational elements mentioned in the source. We won't be doing a deep dive on these today, but they serve as crucial reminders for overall metabolic health.
Absolutely. Good idea. First and foremost is quality and sufficient sleep. As we've discussed in previous deep dives, prioritizing sleep remains a cornerstone for overall well-being, and that definitely includes robust metabolic function.
Secondly, the source emphasizes the importance of adequate essential fatty acids, recommending an intake of over 1,000 milligrams of EPA daily. These fats play vital roles in numerous aspects of health, including mood regulation and, importantly here, metabolic processes.
The potential benefits of glutamine for managing sugar cravings and promoting a healthy gut environment were also highlighted. It's an interesting amino acid that, can offer support in those specific areas.
And let's not forget the necessity of sufficient iodine and selenium for healthy thyroid function and a well-regulated metabolism.
Right, the thyroid connection.
Yeah, and the source specifically points to Brazil nuts as a convenient and potent source of selenium. Just a few can make a difference.
Good tip. Finally, supporting a thriving gut microbiome through the regular consumption of fermented foods was noted as another key component for overall metabolic health. Makes sense.
Now, let's shift our focus to a truly captivating area, the power of belief. The source discusses a really compelling study by Alia Crum at Stanford.
Oh, I remember reading about that.
Yeah. It demonstrated that simply believing that physical activity is beneficial can actually lead to greater fat loss and improved health markers.
Isn't that incredible? It wasn't just about whether people were active. Their perception of their activity made a real difference, like the hotel staff example.
Exactly. The ones who were informed that their daily work met the criteria for physical activity actually experienced more fat loss and better blood pressure, I believe.
Yeah. So a key insight here is our mindset can have a tangible impact on our physiology. It's not just woo-woo.
No, this study beautifully illustrates the profound influence of the nervous system, extending beyond the simple mechanics of energy expenditure. Our thoughts and beliefs can have concrete effects on our bodies.
Which really makes you wonder how much more control do we actually have over our biology through our minds than we currently realize?
It's a fascinating question.
So with that powerful mind-body connection in mind, let's get into the practicalities of how our bodies actually utilize fat. The source breaks this down into two essential steps: mobilization and oxidation. Can you walk us through those?
Certainly. So imagine fat stored in your fat cells as fuel that's basically locked away.
Okay.
The first step is getting that fuel out of storage. That's mobilization. Then, once that fat is moving around, it needs to be used for energy. That's oxidation, or, burning it.
Right, mobilization, then burning. The source used a helpful analogy of breaking the backbone between fatty acids and glycerol for mobilization.
Yeah, that really paints a picture of freeing up the usable fatty acids from their storage form.
It does.
Precisely. Once these fatty acids are mobilized and circulating in your bloodstream, they travel to cells that can use them for fuel muscle cells, for instance.
But they're not burned just yet.
Not yet. They then need to be transported into the mitochondria, the tiny powerhouses within your cells. That's where they act as the fuel, getting oxidized to produce ATP, which is your body's primary energy currency.
Got it. Mitochondria are key. And the crucial takeaway here, as you mentioned, is that both of these vital steps, getting the fat out of storage, mobilization, and then actually burning it for energy, oxidation, are largely governed by our nervous system.
And what's fascinating here is the key molecule that facilitates both mobilization and oxidation: epinephrine, also known as adrenaline.
Or adrenaline, okay.
This is the signal released by neurons that directly connect to fat cells. It's like a switch turning on the fat-burning process locally, right at the source.
Now, this is where a common misunderstanding gets clarified, right? The adrenaline responsible for this localized fat burning isn't primarily coming from the adrenal glands way up by the kidneys, flooding your entire system.
Exactly. That systemic adrenaline rush is different. Instead, this is epinephrine being released very specifically by these neurons right at the fat cells themselves.
So the key insight here is fat burning can be targeted more locally than we might think. It's not just a whole body wash.
That's a critical distinction. This localized control mechanism means that specific actions and behaviors can directly target fat loss by stimulating these particular neurons in certain areas.
Okay, so we understand the two-part process: mobilization, oxidation, and the role of local epinephrine. Let's dive into some actionable tools. The first one is intriguing: non-exercise activity thermogenesis, or NEAT, basically the power of fidgeting.
Yes. This is a really surprising and often overlooked aspect of energy expenditure. The concept of NEAT and its significant impact on metabolism was first highlighted by the research of Rothwell and Stock way back in the 1960s and 70s.
And the story of how they made this observation is so relatable. They noticed that some individuals could overeat without gaining weight.
Right, the perplexing cases.
And their secret wasn't some restrictive diet. It was their natural inclination to engage in lots of subtle, seemingly insignificant movements. They were just natural fidgeters.
Exactly. You know the type. Think about those people who constantly bounce their knees under the table, tap their feet, maybe bob their heads while listening, frequently stand up and sit down, or pace while on the phone.
Yeah, I know people like that.
Those are all prime examples of fidgeting, of NEAT.
And the calorie burn associated with this seemingly minor activity is actually quite significant. The source mentions that fidgeters can burn anywhere from 800 to a remarkable 2,500 calories more per day compared to those who tend to stay still.
It's a huge range, but even at the lower end, 800 calories is substantial.
It really is. So the key insight here is you don't necessarily need grueling workouts to significantly boost your calorie expenditure. These small, consistent movements add up dramatically over the day.
It truly is dramatic. And the why behind this is key. These small, often unconscious movements trigger the local release of epinephrine from the neurons connected to fat tissue.
The epinephrine again.
Exactly. Leading to a surprising increase in both fat mobilization and oxidation. It keeps that fat-mining furnace lightly stoked all day.
So for you, the listener, this is incredibly accessible. You can literally increase your calorie burn throughout the day without needing to carve out extra time for intense workouts. It's about consciously incorporating more movement, even subtle movement, into your existing routine. Stand up more, pace, tap your foot.
Be a fidgeter. Our second tool takes us in a completely different direction, leveraging cold and shivering for fat loss.
Cold exposure. Okay, that's definitely been a hot topic lately. No pun intended.
Right. This source explains that there are different types of fat in our bodies. White fat, the primary energy storage we're most familiar with.
The stuff we usually want less of.
Generally, yes. Then there's brown fat, which is thermogenic, meaning it produces heat and it's packed with mitochondria, those energy powerhouses. And then there's beige fat, which is kind of intermediate, has characteristics of both.
Okay, white, brown, beige. Got it.
What's fascinating is that cold exposure can activate that brown fat and even promote the conversion of beige fat into brown fat. Essentially, it makes your body better at burning energy to generate heat. You build a hotter internal furnace, so to speak.
But here's the counterintuitive part, highlighted by a study in Nature, I think you said. It's not just about getting cold, it's the shivering that really drives the increased metabolism and fat loss, specifically through brown fat activation.
That's the crucial point.
So the key insight here is the body's natural response to cold, the shivering, is actually a powerful fat-burning mechanism we can leverage.
That's right. Shivering, which is essentially low-level muscle contraction, kind of like micro-exercise in response to cold, releases a molecule called succinate. This succinate then acts directly on brown fat to ramp up thermogenesis heat production and consequently fat burning.
Interesting. Succinate. And the protocol for using cold effectively for fat loss might surprise people. It's not about enduring prolonged icy discomfort, is it?
No, not according to this source for this specific goal. The suggestion is get into the cold, uncomfortable, but safe temperature, obviously.
Right, safety first.
Shiver for about a minute or so, then get out, but don't dry off immediately. Rest for 1-3 minutes, letting the evaporation cool you further, potentially inducing more shivering, and repeat this cycle maybe 2-3 times.
So it's cycles of cold, shiver, get out, rest, repeat, maybe 1-5 times per week.
Exactly. The key seems to be the cooling and rewarming cycle, as this appears more effective at inducing that beneficial shivering. It's also important to avoid resisting the shiver if fat loss is your goal.
Right. Don't try to tough it out and stop shivering.
And also to be cautious about prolonged cold exposure without these intermittent breaks, as that could lead to different physiological responses or risks.
Makes sense. And you mentioned a website for protocols.
Yeah, the source mentioned thecoldplunge.com as a resource for more detailed protocols if listeners are interested in exploring this further.
Good resource. Now, let's touch upon a topic that has been, well, debated for years. Spot reduction.
Ah, yes, the holy grail for some.
Exactly. The long-held belief, the dogma almost, is that you can't target fat loss to specific areas of the body. Doing endless crunches won't magically melt away just belly fat.
That's been the standard advice forever. But the emerging science is suggesting that targeted fat loss might not be entirely a myth after all. It's nuanced.
Okay, how so?
What's fascinating is the idea that because of that local release of epinephrine by neurons innervating specific fat pads or deposits.
Local adrenaline connection.
Exactly. It's theorized that exercise that strongly activates nerve fibers in a particular area could theoretically increase fat mobilization specifically from those sites, more so than from distant fat stores.
So maybe not magic, but a potential influence.
A potential influence, yes. The practical takeaway for you, the listener, isn't that you can magically sculpt one area, but maybe that varying your exercise routines and incorporating novel movements could help you access those, stubborn fat areas by engaging different neural pathways that haven't been stimulated as much.
So mix it up, try different exercises, maybe engage muscles around the areas you're concerned about more intensely or in new ways. It's something to consider as you plan your workouts.
Worth considering. Our third tool brings us to more traditional methods. Strategic exercise for fat loss. The source categorizes exercise by intensity. High-intensity interval training, HIIT, sprint interval training, SIT, even shorter, more intense bursts, and moderate-intensity continuous training, MICT, like steady-state cardio.
Right. And the big question many of you have is about fasted versus fed exercise. Does it really make a difference for fat loss? The source sheds some light on this by explaining that insulin, which rises after you eat, actually inhibits fat oxidation.
That's a crucial point. Insulin essentially tells your body to store energy, not burn stored fat.
So for moderate intensity exercise, often referred to as zone 2 cardio, like a brisk walk or a light jog, there appears to be a switchover point around the 90-minute mark. If you've eaten before, the source suggests you'll burn less fat from that point onward compared to if you were exercising in a fasted state.
Interesting. So for longer duration, moderate exercise, fasted seems potentially better for fat burn during that later part of the session.
Yeah. And interestingly, for higher intensity training sessions, HIIT or SIT, lasting between maybe 20 and 60 minutes, This switch over to enhanced fat burning with fasted training seems to occur much earlier.
Okay, so maybe you get into fat burning quicker with high intensity if you're fasted.
That seems to be the implication. So the practical advice for optimizing fat loss could be to consider high-intensity training, maybe followed by some moderate-intensity cardio, ideally in a fasted state if, and this is a big if, it's safe and feasible for you personally.
Right. Individual tolerance and safety are paramount. Don't push yourself into unsafe territory just because something might be optimal.
Absolutely. The concept of the afterburn effect, or
Yeah.
EPIOC, post-exercise oxygen consumption, is also relevant here.
Right, burning calories after you stop exercising.
Exactly. And high-intensity exercise generally leads to a greater afterburn, including more fat burning after the workout is complete compared to lower-intensity exercise.
While moderate to low intensity exercise might burn a higher percentage of fat during the activity itself, the post-workout period sees a greater reliance on glycogen, stored carbs, burning, even though fat burn might still be elevated above baseline.
So putting it together, a potential recommendation for fat loss optimization could be incorporating high-intensity training a few times a week, maybe followed by some moderate or low-intensity exercise, and ideally doing this fasted if possible.
It creates a scenario where you get the big metabolic disturbance and afterburn from the HIT, and then potentially tap into more fat stores during the subsequent lower intensity work or just throughout the rest of the day.
And the source even shared an anecdote about someone using short, intense workouts, followed by just a busy lifestyle, lots of walking, standing, general movement.
Back to neat.
Exactly, as a
Yeah.
practical approach.
Yeah.
It all comes back to that adrenaline-myobuninephrine connection being stimulated through various forms of movement.
Precisely. Regardless of the type of movement, that epinephrine release is the key effector driving fat mobilization and oxidation.
Now, let's move on to our fourth tool area, specific compounds that can potentially enhance fat loss. And the source rightly emphasizes prioritizing these behavioral tools, movement, sleep, maybe cold, before jumping straight to supplements.
Absolutely. Supplements are helpers, not magic bullets. First up is caffeine, a very common compound.
Can't start the day without it for many people.
True. The source explains how it can increase fat oxidation, likely by promoting the release of epinephrine. There it is again. This seems to be effective at dosages up to around 400 milligrams per day for those who are caffeine adapted.
But with a clear caution, right?
Yes, a clear caution about individual sensitivity, potential side effects like anxiety, sleep disruption, etc. Know your tolerance.
So a practical application could be considering 100-400 milligrams of caffeine about 30-40 minutes before your workout, if you tolerate it well and it fits your health profile.
Next, the source introduces yerba mate and guayusa teas as potential GLP-1 boosters.
GLP-1, that's been in the news related to weight loss drugs.
It has. GLP-1 is a gut hormone that, among other things, helps regulate blood sugar and can facilitate fat burning, partly by working in opposition to insulin. These teas seem to naturally increase GLP-1 levels.
Interesting. And meat consumption, especially before exercise, has been shown in some studies to increase fat oxidation.
Yes, and there was a neat tip about potentially re-steeping or reusing mate leaves, as some compounds that boost GLP-1 might be released more slowly or require more extraction time.
And guayusa is presented as a slightly sweeter tasting alternative for those who maybe don't love the taste of traditional yerba mate.
Right. And it's important, as you hinted, to note that there are also prescription GLP-1 analogs like semaglutide, Ozempic, Wegovy. These are powerful medications that absolutely require a doctor's prescription and supervision. We're talking about teas here, a much milder effect.
Very important distinction. Finally, the source discusses L-carnitine and its cousin, acetyl L-carnitine. What's their role?
These compounds play a role inside the cell, specifically in facilitating fat oxidation. They essentially help shuttle fatty acids into the mitochondria, where they can be burned for energy. Think of them as escorts for fat into the furnace.
Okay, so they help with the oxidation step.
Exactly. And supplementation with L-carnitine has been shown in some studies to potentially increase fat loss, with typical dosages ranging from maybe 500 milligrams up to 2 grams per day.
And acetyl L-carnitine.
The acetyl L-carnitine is often considered to be better absorbed and can cross the blood-brain barrier, so it sometimes has cognitive benefit attributed to it. The source also mentioned it might offer additional perks like reducing exercise-induced ammonia, lowering C-reactive protein, a marker of inflammation, slightly improving blood glucose and lipids, and potentially reducing fatigue and inflammation.
So potentially broader benefits beyond just fat transport.
Potentially, yes. Again, individual results can vary.
Okay, wow, we've covered a lot. Let's try to recap some of the key takeaways from this incredibly informative deep dive. We've explored the surprising power of fidgeting, neat, as a really accessible way to burn more calories daily.
Definitely a big one. Then there's the shiver-induced fat burning through strategic cold exposure using those short cycles.
Right, leveraging the body's natural response. We touched on the potential, however nuanced, for influencing stubborn fat with varied exercise, hitting different neural pathways.
Challenging the old dogma slightly. And then the science behind fasted training for different exercise intensities and the mechanisms of specific compounds like caffeine, yerba mate guayusa for GLP-1, and L-carnitine for fat transport.
It's crucial, I think, for you, the listener, to consider how you can thoughtfully integrate these science-backed tools into your own life. Remember that even small, consistent changes like fidgeting more or trying those cold cycles occasionally can have a significant cumulative impact.
Absolutely. This information really empowers you to move beyond just generic advice. Eat less, move more, and take a more informed, more nuanced approach to your fat loss goals, working with your nervous system.
And if you're keen to delve even deeper into any of these areas, the source mentioned a fantastic review by Bartness and others on the neural innervation of white adipose tissue, how nerves connect to fat.
Yeah, that sounds like a deep dive in itself.
Totally. And also the website examine.com, which is just a treasure trove of evidence-based information on various supplements and health topics.
Great resource. Which leads us to maybe a provocative final thought for you to consider. Given the significant, as we've discussed, often underestimated role of the nervous system in something like fat loss,
All right.
what other aspects of our physiology might be more directly under our behavioral or even mental control than we currently believe?
That's a fantastic question to ponder. Where else does this mind-body nervous system connection play a bigger role than we realize? Food for thought. And if you found this deep dive insightful and helpful in understanding the science behind fat loss, please consider subscribing to the show on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you listen. We also greatly appreciate you leaving reviews and providing feedback, especially in the YouTube comments section. That really helps us tailor future deep dives to what you're interested in. Thanks so much for joining us.